Thank you for inviting me to talk about a topic which I believe is something that is important when it comes to working in Canada. Indigenous relations is something that many science fields never really touch on, and in my experience in university, I felt that Indigenous relations was never a topic discussed. My name is Rachel Graham, and I am from a small community in northern Alberta called Fort Chipewyan. I'm a member of the Mixed Cree First Nation, which is on Treaty 8 territory. I spent the majority of my life out on the land learning from my family ways to hunt, trap, respecting nature, and the importance of being stewards of the land. I took those teachings on my educational journey, getting my environmental science degree from Concordia University of Edmonton. I currently work for my First Nation as an environmental manager for the Government and Industry Relations Division. I use my Western science and traditional knowledge to help inform decision making for maintaining, preserving, and protecting our ancestral lands. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. This quote is used to describe the length that our treaties should last. It also means that it's up to us to protect the land and ensure that the land and water can still grow and flow so we can see tomorrow. I have two lectures to go over. The first lecture is titled History and Protocols in Indigenous Relations. The second is Science and Indigenous Knowledge. For this lecture, I will be going over the history of First Nations, treaty rights, land claims, importance of protocols, Indigenous worldviews, and environmental stewardship, Indigenous quality criteria, and finally the conclusion. I also have a few case studies to help emphasize the points. This lecture is to explain why it is important to educate yourself on Indigenous people and our protocols. In Canada, there is 634 First Nations, and in Alberta, there is 48. Each, each First Nation community is unique and have their own customs and traditions which they may practice. One important piece of First Nation history is the residential schools. The residential schools were a dark chapter in Canadian history, spanning from 1831 to 1996. These government-funded and church-run institutions forcibly removed over 150,000 Indigenous children from their families. For context, the first residential school opened in 1831 in Ontario. The last one didn't close until 1996 in Saskatchewan. That's not ancient history. If I had grown up in Saskatchewan, I would have been in the residential school until grade 3. Many people assume that this was a distant past, but it's not. Indigenous children, aged 7 to 15, were mandated by law to attend these schools, and their parents faced severe consequences if they tried to resist or hide their children. Up until the 1950s, the children weren't even allowed to go home during breaks, spending their entire formative years in these institutions. While at these schools, the children were stripped of their identities. They weren't allowed to speak their languages, practice their cultures, or learn from their elders. They lost their connection with the land and the traditions that defined who they were. Now, imagine being taken from your parents as a young child, placed in a cold institution run by priests and sisters with no love, nurturing, or guidance. For many, these schools replaced parental figures with authority figures who enforced strict discipline. This severance from family and culture created a legacy of intergenerational trauma. How does one learn to be a parent if they are never raised by one? The effects of residential schools continue to ripple through Indigenous communities, contributing to social and economic challenges today. Acknowledging this history is crucial to reconciliation and healing. And it's not just about remembering what happened, it's about understanding the ongoing impacts and taking the steps to rebuild and restore what is lost. This is why it's so important to educate ourselves and others about the truth of residential schools. Remember when I said the last school closed in 1996? Think about how many generations were raised in this system where you're not given love or had a model of what parents are. Both of my parents were in the residential school system, and I know firsthand the damage that being raised without love can do. According to the 2021 statistics, 58.3% of children in foster care were Indigenous children. In 2021, Indigenous children only made up 7.7% of the population of children in Canada. You're probably asking yourself, why should you care? Unfortunately, you don't live in a bubble. At some point in your life, you will have an interaction with an Indigenous person. I am imploring you to educate yourself on Indigenous history in Canada and always come up from a place of understanding and empathy. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 is our first official document to state what our rights are as Indigenous people. This document is significant because it created the first agreement between Indigenous people and the Crown. It states, upon any lands whatever which, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, as foresaid, are reserved to the said Indians, or any of them. It basically says that King George states that any land not purchased by the Crown is Indian land. After the Royal Proclamation came the number treaties. Treaties are agreements made between Indigenous nations and the Crown, designed to define relationships, land use, and mutual obligations. These agreements are often framed as a way to share land and resources while ensuring the preservation of Indigenous rights and traditional ways of life. It is important to remember that the treaties were not about giving up Indigenous sovereignty, but rather finding a way to coexist peacefully and fairly. Historically, treaties varied across time and regions. Early treaties from the 16th to 1700s focused on establishing peace and trade relationships. The number treaties from 1871 to 1921 spanned vast areas of Canada, where land was exchanged for promises such as reserves, annuities, healthcare, education, and provisions. These treaties were unique to each region, reflecting on the specific needs and circumstances of the time. Treaty rights are essential to understanding the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. These include rights to hunt, fish, and trap on traditional lands, which are protected under Section 35 of the Constitutions Act of 1982. This section recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, making these agreements a living part of Canadian law. It is also important to note that the treaties are agreements between Indigenous nations and the Crown, not with provincial governments. Provinces cannot alter or override treaty rights, and Indigenous lands are federally protected. This means that any activity impacting treaty rights, whether it's industrial development or land use, must be carefully considered. Treaty rights ensure the survival of Indigenous traditions and ways of life. When those rights are infringed upon, this often leads to complex and continuous situations. This is why understanding and respecting treaties is so crucial in Canada today. Now, let's look at a case study to understand why treaty rights are so important. In 2021, the Blueberry River First Nation, a Treaty 8 nation in northeastern BC, challenged the provincial government in court, claiming that cumulative industrial development such as oil, gas, and logging activities violated their treaty rights to hunt, fish, and trap. They argued that unchecked industrial activities degraded their traditional lands, and the province failed in its duty to protect their rights under Treaty 8. The BC Supreme Court ruled in favor of Blueberry River First Nation, marking a significant victory for Indigenous rights. The court acknowledged that cumulative industrial impacts infringed on treaty rights, setting a legal precedence for addressing such violations. The decision required that the provincial government to halt further industrial approvals until sustainable land use plans were developed. As a result, the province and BRFN entered negotiations to create collaborative land management strategies, emphasizing sustainable development and Indigenous stewardship. This case not only reinforced the importance of treaty obligations, but also highlighted the necessity of balancing resource development with the protection of traditional lands and Indigenous rights. In Canada, there are many areas where historical grievances remain unresolved due to the government's failure to uphold treaty obligations or mismanagement of Indigenous lands. Remember the Royal Proclamation that stated that the land was Indigenous land until it was bought by the Crown? This is the mess that came of it. These disputes often form the basis of specific claims, which are critical to addressing injustices and supporting reconciliation between Indigenous nations and the Crown. The process for resolving these claims involves several key stages, starting with the research to document the issue, followed by legal opinion preparation to assess its validity, and finally, an invitation to negotiate. Resolutions can occur through these negotiations, administrative remedies, or a specific claim tribunal when disputes cannot be resolved directly. Currently, specific claims are categorized based on their status, whether in progress, concluded, or under other designations such as litigation or awaiting responses. Active files include those under legal review, awaiting negotiations, or in tribunal proceedings. Each claim represents an opportunity to rectify past wrongs and rebuild trust between Indigenous communities and the government. Transparency and accountability are essential in this process. Regular updates ensure fairness and foster trust, helping to maintain momentum in addressing these claims. As professionals, it is vital to recognize the importance of specific claims and ensure that you've done your due diligence when working on or near Indigenous lands. If you're uncertain about whether a claim exists in a particular area, the Specific Claims website is an excellent resource to consult. Taking the time to understand and respect these processes is key to fostering meaningful and respectful relationships with Indigenous nations. Let's look at another case study where unceded land plays a big part. The James Bay project, initiated in the 1970s by Hydro-Quebec, is one of Canada's largest hydroelectric projects. It involved extensive damming of the Langage River in northern Quebec, flooding over 11,500 square kilometers of forest, rivers, and Indigenous lands. These massive developments sparked significant conflict with the Cree and Inuit peoples, whose traditional territories were directly impacted. For the Cree and Inuit communities, the project disrupted their way of life, limiting access to their lands and threatening the ecosystem they depended on. The situation escalated into a legal battle leading to the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement in 1975, which became Canada's first modern land claim settlement. This agreement not only provided compensation, but also recognized Cree and Inuit rights to their traditional lands, setting an important precedent. The James Bay project highlighted the ongoing tension between resource development and Indigenous rights. It forced Canada to confront the need for consultation and negotiation when Indigenous territories are affected. The lessons from this case shaped how modern land claims disputes are approached, ensuring that Indigenous voices are heard in decisions that impact their lands and communities. This case demonstrates the importance of balancing development with the protection of Indigenous rights. Next is the importance of protocols. Along with doing your due diligence to check if the land is undergoing specific claims cases, it is important to always follow a protocol when entering Indigenous land. Even when the activity you're undertaking may not be harmful, it is important to gain permission. Indigenous people have a close connection to the land. Our food, medicines, and history comes from the land. The risk of damaging areas which are culturally significant is possible. Entering Indigenous land without permission is not just disrespectful, but a violation of sovereignty. Plus, this is our home. It's usually customary to knock before you enter someone's home, isn't it? There are many factors that go into decision making. I want to introduce you to a teaching that influences the way we think. 7 generations is a guiding law that was thought to have originated in the Iroquois nation. While our 7 generations look towards the future, the way I was taught considers the past 7 generations and 7 generations forward. During decision making, we think about the past and what has occurred to lead us to the present. What lessons do we need to take away? The morals and thought processes of our ancestors need to be considered. Only then can we think about the next 7 generations. What impacts will our decisions have on the future? We constantly strive for improvement, but sometimes that may not be the best choice. Looking forward to 7 generations, we don't want the problem to continue. We must consider the economic impact denying permits will have on the future. Can we sustain our lifestyle and way of life, allowing or not allowing development to continue? We take from the past to decide the future because, above all else, we must return to treaty. Upholding our treaty rights only benefits us as a nation. The 7 generations ahead benefit when treaty rights are protected. Let's discuss the importance of environmental stewardship, which is about responsibly managing and protecting natural resources to ensure sustainability for current and future generations. First, Indigenous approaches to stewardship emphasize interconnectedness with nature. Guided by traditional ecological knowledge, they focus on respect, mutualism, and balance. The 7 generations philosophy reminds us to consider the impacts of our actions on both the past and the future. Stewardship involves sustainable practices like conserving biodiversity, protecting ecosystems, and minimizing environmental footprints, especially in resource development. Indigenous communities play a vital role by leading land and water monitoring efforts, wildlife conservation, and restoration projects. Collaborative approaches that combine Indigenous knowledge and Western science are critical for success. Finally, this work aligns with global efforts, such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, by promoting environmental resilience and equity. Environmental stewardship is not just a responsibility, it's a necessity to ensure the well-being of people and the planet for generations to come. When thinking about environmental stewardship, I want to present you with a guideline. This guideline considers how water is used for Indigenous purposes. This is called the water quality criteria for Indigenous use. Existing water quality guidelines often fail to consider Indigenous needs like direct surface water consumption and traditional food practices. The WQCIU includes tailored health risk criteria to ensure water safety for humans, wildlife, aquatic ecosystems, reflecting Indigenous consumption patterns. The water holds deep cultural and spiritual significance for Indigenous peoples. Protecting it upholds treaty rights and practices. The WQCIU also evaluates contaminant bioaccumulation, safeguarding both food webs and human health. This framework respects Indigenous water use, aligns with treaty rights, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It also fosters collaboration among stakeholders. Thank you for taking the time to learn about the history and protocols in Indigenous relations. Understanding these elements is essential for fostering respectful relationships and making informed decisions in Canada. From the significance of treaties to the impacts of industrialization and the value of Indigenous worldviews, this presentation emphasized why acknowledging and respecting Indigenous rights and teachings is critical. Some of the takeaways, I hope, are treaties are not just historical documents, they're living agreements that define rights and responsibilities. Protocols are not optional, they're about respecting sovereignty and ensuring collaboration benefits everyone. Indigenous teachings like the Seven Generations philosophy and environmental stewardship guide decisions that balance sustainability with cultural preservation. As we move forward, I encourage each of you to reflect on your role in upholding these principles in your work and in daily lives. One topic I haven't yet addressed is reconciliation. Reconciliation is a process of restoring and building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, governments, and institutions. It involves addressing historical injustices, acknowledging the ongoing impacts of colonialism, and creating equitable pathways for Indigenous self-determination and cultural preservation. Canada has made several commitments to reconciliation, including efforts to address past wrongdoings, uphold Indigenous rights, and foster healing and collaboration. It is important to recognize that reconciliation is not solely a government responsibility. It's a shared commitment that benefits all people and ensures a better future for the land we call home. Thank you for your attention. My email is there if you have any questions or like further information. Thank you for listening and have a great day.